Blood stained the imported silk of her dress, but it wasn't hers. Sylvia watched the man she had hired wiping a dented metal blade on his dark denim trousers. He didn't wear powered armor. He didn't have a personal energy shield. He was bleeding from a plasma burn that would have liquefied a standard species, yet he merely grunted and wrapped a piece of torn fabric around it. She had paid for a bodyguard. She didn't know she had purchased a monster. Dust danced in the sterile, pale light of the broker's office. Sylvia sat with her back straight, her hands folded over the smooth leather of her purse, trying not to show the tremor in her fingers. She was a diplomat. Showing fear was equivalent to bleeding in shark-infested waters, and the political elite of the Orion Traverse were nothing if not sharks. Roland, the security broker, sat across from her. He possessed the soft, powdered features of a man who had never seen a day of actual violence, yet he traded in it daily. He tapped a polished fingernail against his glass desk. "You are asking for a miracle, Sylvia," Roland said softly. "Vincent has put a bounty on your head that is large enough to buy a small moon. The Standard Orbital Guard will not take this contract. Even the elite private firms are declining. They consider you a walking corpse." "I have money," Sylvia replied. Her voice was steady, a practiced illusion. "I have clearance codes. I need someone who doesn't care about Vincent's political reach." "You don't need a guard," Roland sighed, leaning back. "You need a localized deterrent, someone entirely disconnected from our political ecosystem." He pressed a button under his desk. The heavy steel door at the back of the room slid open. Footsteps echoed against the floorboards. They were heavy, too heavy. The man who walked into the room didn't glide with the low-gravity grace that was customary on this station. He walked like every step was an argument with the ground, and he was winning. He wore a faded canvas jacket, a simple white shirt, and dark trousers. No visible weapons. No cybernetic implants glowing along his jawline. No armored carapace. He looked entirely, unremarkable plain, but the air in the room shifted when he entered. It was a predatory density, a quiet, looming gravity. "Sylvia, meet Donovan," Roland said, a hint of nervous tension tightening his voice. "He is an off-world contractor, independent." Donovan stopped a few feet from her. He looked down. His eyes were a flat, cold blue. There was no polite smile, no slight bow of respect. He just looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her posture, the exits, the reflective surface of the glass desk, and finally resting back on her face. "She's small," Donovan said. His voice was gravel, deep and unbothered. "Target profile is a nightmare. Too exposed." "Excuse me?" Sylvia bristled. "I am the senior representative of the—" "I don't care," Donovan interrupted. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer bluntness cut her off instantly. "If I take the job, you do exactly what I tell you. You don't argue about schedules. You don't make unscheduled stops for coffee. You don't open windows." Sylvia looked at Roland, expecting him to reprimand the man for his insolence. Roland simply looked away, studying a corner of his ceiling. "What are your qualifications?" Sylvia asked, turning back to the human. She had read about his kind, vaguely. Humans. Sol 3. A restricted zone. Most civilized species avoided it. The travel brochures listed it as a high-risk environmental hazard. "I'm alive," Donovan said. He pulled out a metal flask, unscrewed the cap, and took a drink. It smelled faintly of industrial solvent and burned sugar. "In my line of work, against the people coming for you, that's the only qualification that matters." "Vincent has hired the Crimson Syndicate," Sylvia stated, laying her cards on the table. She wanted to see him flinch. "They utilize phase shift snipers and kinetic pulse explosives. My last detail was vaporized in their own armored transport. Donovan screwed the cap back on his flask. He didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly, processing the information as if she had just told him it might rain tomorrow. "Armor makes you slow," Donovan muttered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Phase shift relies on thermal tracking. We drop your core temperature, stick to the service corridors, and avoid open sight lines. If they get close, they die." He said it with terrifying absolute certainty. They die. Not "I will neutralize them," or "we will apprehend them." "He is from Earth, Sylvia," Roland interjected quietly. "A Class 9 Deathworld. Their gravity is nearly double the galactic standard. Their atmosphere is corrosive. Their microfauna is lethal. Donovan's baseline bone density and muscle mass make him uniquely suited for close-quarters survival." Sylvia stared at the man. He didn't look like a heavily armored tank. He just looked dense, compact, like a coiled spring made of raw iron. "My budget is 3 million credits for 1 week of protection," Sylvia said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Until the summit. Keep me breathing until I testify." Donovan looked at the ceiling, doing the math in his head. Then he looked back at her. 4 million. And I want an advance for ammunition. "Ammunition," Sylvia frowned. "Energy cells are provided at the armory." "I don't use energy weapons," Donovan said flatly. He patted the heavy bulge under his canvas jacket. "Energy dissipates. Kinetic mass puts things in the ground and keeps them there." Sylvia swallowed hard. Her refined sensibilities recoiled at the sheer barbarism of his words. This was a man who still used chemical explosions to launch pieces of metal at his enemies. It was primitive. It was savage. But right now, savagery was exactly what she needed. Vincent had brought a slaughterhouse to her doorstep. She needed a butcher to fight back. "Agreed," Sylvia said, standing up. She extended a hand. Donovan looked at her hand for a moment. He reached out and grasped it. His grip was shockingly firm. His skin was rough, calloused, scarred. He was warm. Radiant heat poured off him, a byproduct of a metabolism built to survive a hostile, freezing planet. For a brief second, Sylvia felt acutely, terrifyingly fragile. If he wanted to, he could snap her wrist with a flick of his thumb. "Get your things," Donovan said, releasing her hand. "We leave in 5 minutes, through the basement. My transport is on the roof," Sylvia objected. "Your transport is a coffin with a target painted on it," Donovan replied, already turning toward the door. "We walk. Move." Sylvia grabbed her bag, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The contract was sealed. She had hired a Deathworlder. Alleys in the lower districts of the Traverse Station smelled like ozone, rotting synthetic protein, and damp steel. Sylvia hated it down here. Her boots, designed for pristine diplomatic carpets, slipped on the oily grating. Donovan walked slightly ahead of her, his pace measured but fast. He moved with a strange, predatory economy. His head swiveled constantly. He wasn't just looking, he was hunting. Every shadow, every flicker of a neon sign, every discarded pile of debris was processed and categorized. "This is ridiculous," Sylvia hissed, pulling her coat tighter against the artificial chill. "We are diplomats. We do not skulk in the maintenance vents like rodents." "Diplomats get shot in the head," Donovan replied without looking back. "Rodents survive." He stopped suddenly, throwing a thick arm out to catch her chest. The impact knocked the wind out of her. Sylvia gasped, ready to berate him, but he clamped a heavy, rough hand over her mouth. "Quiet," he breathed. Sylvia froze. The alley was empty. Water dripped from a rusted pipe above them. A distant ventilation fan hummed. She saw nothing. She heard nothing. Donovan's posture shifted, His shoulders dropped. His hand slid into his jacket. He was staring at a pile of crates 30 yards ahead, stacked near a maintenance hatch. To Sylvia, it was just trash. To Donovan's predatory instincts, honed by a planet that actively tried to kill him every second of his evolution, it was an ambush. The shadows didn't align. The airflow was wrong. "Back up," Donovan whispered, pushing her behind a heavy steel support pillar. "Don't look around the corner." Before she could process the command, the darkness erupted. A searing line of blue plasma punched through the space where Sylvia's chest had been a second prior. The air superheated instantly, a crack of thunder deafening her. Concrete exploded, showering her in stinging shrapnel. Two figures detached themselves from the shadows near the crates. They wore sleek, light-bending camouflage suits. Syndicate assassins. They moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance in low-gravity leaps, their weapons charging for a second volley. Sylvia squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the end. Instead, she heard a sound that defied reason. A thunderous, mechanical clack, followed by an explosion so loud she felt it in her teeth. Donovan hadn't retreated. He stepped out from cover. He held a massive, blocky metal weapon. No glowing lights, no hum of a battery. Just crude, brutal steel. He pulled the trigger. The kinetic force of the weapon was absurd. Fire and smoke belched from the barrel. The heavy slug crossed the distance faster than the eye could track. It struck the leading assassin mid-leap. The Syndicate operative's personal energy shield flared briefly, trying to deflect the blow. Energy shields were designed to dissipate plasma and laser fire. They were not designed to stop half an ounce of solid lead traveling at supersonic speeds. The shield shattered like glass. The slug took the assassin in the center of the chest. The sheer kinetic transfer threw the attacker violently backward, slamming them into the metal wall with a sickening crunch. They didn't get up. The second assassin landed, instantly adjusting their aim toward the new threat. A pulse of plasma grazed Donovan's shoulder. Sylvia screamed as the fabric of his jacket ignited, flesh charring instantly. It was a fatal hit. It should have dropped him. A standard species would have gone into systemic shock, their nervous system shutting down from the pain. Donovan didn't even stumble. He barely grimaced. His body, flooded with a chemical cocktail of adrenaline and cortisol unique to Earth's apex predators, simply ignored the trauma. He dropped the heavy gun. It was too slow for this range, and lunged. He crossed the remaining 10 feet in a blur of terrifying, high-gravity momentum. The assassin tried to bring their weapon up, but Donovan was already there. He grabbed the assassin's wrist. Sylvia heard the distinct dry snap of bone breaking. The assassin let out a high-pitched shriek as the weapon fell to the ground. Donovan didn't hesitate. He stepped into the attacker's guard, seized them by the throat, and lifted them entirely off the ground with one hand. The alien thrashed, kicking at Donovan's torso, but the human was immovable, like a statue carved from granite. With a brutal, clinical efficiency, Donovan slammed the assassin into the floor grating. The impact echoed down the alley. The thrashing stopped. Silence rushed back into the space, broken only by the hum of the distant fan and Donovan's heavy breathing. Sylvia peered around the pillar, trembling violently. The two elite assassins, killers who had terrorized the political sector for a decade, were broken on the ground. The entire engagement had lasted less than 4 seconds. Donovan stood over the second body. He patted down the pockets, retrieved a small datapad, and crushed the assassin's comms earpiece beneath his heavy boot. He finally looked down at his shoulder. The plasma had burned a hole the size of a fist through his jacket. Angry, blistered skin was visible beneath it. "You're dying," Sylvia stammered, stepping out from the pillar. Her legs felt like liquid. "That's a 3rd-degree plasma burn. You need a trauma team." Donovan looked at his shoulder, then back at her. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small roll of silver tape, and began wrapping it tightly over the charred fabric and burned flesh. "It missed the artery," Donovan said calmly, gritting his teeth as he pulled the tape taut. "Just meat damage. Hurts like a bitch, but I'll live." He picked up his heavy kinetic weapon, checked the chamber, and looked at Sylvia. His eyes were still that flat, cold blue, but now the adrenaline made them sharp, dilated, feral. "I told you they were tracking your transport," Donovan said, his voice entirely devoid of panic. "They know we're on foot now. It's going to get harder." Sylvia stared at the blood, the smoke, and the man who had just casually survived a fatal encounter and patched it with hardware tape. She finally understood what the broker meant. She hadn't hired a guard. She had unleashed a predator from a world where everything dies, and he was the one thing that refused to. "Let's go," Sylvia whispered, stepping over the debris. She didn't complain about the maintenance vents anymore. Corridors stretched endlessly into the station's neglected bowels, a decaying maze of rusted pipes and flickering halogen bulbs. Sylvia followed Donovan, her breath catching in her throat with every sudden hiss of a steam valve. The lower maintenance levels were a graveyard for outdated technology. They were also a sanctuary for those who needed to vanish. Donovan moved with a heavy, rolling gait. He favored his left side. The silver hardware tape on his shoulder was already soaked through, a dark, spreading stain that looked black under the dim yellow lighting. He did not complain. He did not ask to stop. He simply kept walking, his flat blue eyes scanning the shadows with a mechanical consistency. They reached a heavy blast door covered in layers of peeling industrial paint. Donovan knocked. It wasn't a desperate pounding, but a precise, syncopated rhythm. 3 heavy strikes, a pause, 2 lighter taps. A rusted viewport slid open. A pair of segmented, compound eyes peered out, reflecting the halogen light. "We are closed," a synthetic voice crackled through a cheap speaker. "Tell Finn that Donovan needs a patch," the human replied, leaning his good shoulder against the bulkhead. "And tell him I have station issue credits." Locks disengaged with a heavy metallic clanking. The door hissed open, revealing a cramped, subterranean clinic that smelled intensely of bleach and synthesized iodine. Finn, a tall, spindly alien with pale grey skin and long, multi-jointed fingers, stood behind a surgical table. He was a disgraced surgeon from the upper sectors, a man who asked no questions as long as the currency cleared. "You are bleeding," Finn observed, his voice a flat, synthesized monotone, translated through a collar at his neck. He looked at Sylvia, his dark eyes narrowing. "And you brought a VIP. That was not our arrangement." "She's the payload," Donovan grunted, pulling his canvas jacket off. The fabric stuck to the charred flesh of his shoulder. He ripped it away in one swift, brutal motion. Sylvia flinched, turning her head. Donovan didn't make a sound, though the muscles in his jaw locked tight. "Sit," Finn ordered, gesturing to the steel table. Donovan sat. He pulled the metal flask from his pocket, unscrewed it, and took a long, steady swallow. Sylvia stood near the door, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She watched as Finn cut away the silver tape and began cleaning the wound. The plasma blast had cooked the tissue down to the muscle. On any civilized species, the limb would require immediate amputation to prevent necrotic shock. "Your biology remains deeply offensive," Finn muttered, struggling to push a sterilized needle through Donovan's skin. "Your epidermal layer is entirely too dense. I am bending my surgical tools." "Just staple it," Donovan said, staring at the blank wall opposite him. Finn sighed, dropping the needle. He retrieved a heavy pneumatic medical stapler. "This will lack any form of aesthetic refinement." "Do it." The mechanical clack, clack, clack of the stapler echoed in the small room. Metal bit into flesh. Sylvia felt her stomach churn. She was a woman of words, of treaties negotiated over crystal glasses of imported wine. Violence, to her, was an abstract concept. It was a casualty statistic on a datapad. Here, it was wet, red, and intensely physical. "Why do you do this?" Sylvia asked, her voice barely a whisper. The silence in the room had become suffocating. Donovan glanced at her. "Do what?" "This. Sell yourself as a shield. You come from a Deathworld. You could have stayed there. You could have lived quietly." Donovan laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound, entirely devoid of humor. "Quietly, right. You don't know much about Earth, do you, Sylvia? I know it is quarantined. It's quarantined because the Galactic Council is terrified of what happens if my people figure out how to mass-produce FTL drives," Donovan said, taking another drink from his flask. "Earth isn't a planet. It's an endurance test. The gravity crushes your spine. The weather drowns you, freezes you, or burns you alive. We spend our entire lives fighting the dirt just to eat. Coming out here, getting shot at by overpriced hitmen? This is a vacation." Finn finished the last staple and sprayed a thick, foaming coagulant over the angry red line. "Your pain receptors should be overwhelming your nervous system," the surgeon noted, studying the biomonitor attached to Donovan's wrist. "Yet your heart rate is stabilizing. Adrenaline crash," Donovan muttered. He rolled his shoulder. The heavy steel staples held the torn muscle together. He looked at Sylvia. "You asked why I do it. Because out here, I'm the monster. Back home, I'm just another guy trying to pay rent. The pay is better here." Sylvia stared at him. The sheer, cynical pragmatism of his words shook her. There was no noble crusade. There was no warrior's code. He was just a laborer, and violence was his trade. "Get some sleep," Donovan told her, pointing to a rigid cot in the corner of the clinic. "We have 6 hours until the shift change in the security sector above us. That's our window to move." "I cannot sleep," Sylvia said, her voice shaking slightly. "Vincent's men are out there. They will not stop." "They won't," Donovan agreed. He picked up his kinetic handgun, checking the mechanical action with practiced fluid motions. "But they have to go through me first." "Lie down." It wasn't a request. Sylvia looked at the bloody metal table, the discarded charred jacket, and the human who sat in the center of the room like a dormant volcano. She walked over to the cot and lay down. The mattress was thin and smelled of old dust. She closed her eyes, expecting panic to keep her awake. Instead, the rhythmic, metallic sound of Donovan cleaning his weapon anchored her. It was a brutal, ugly sound. But for the first time since the bounty was placed on her head, Sylvia felt remarkably safe. Vibrations rattled the surgical trays. Sylvia jolted awake, her heart hammering against her ribs. The clinic was bathed in a low, red emergency light. Finn was nowhere to be seen. Donovan was standing near the heavy blast door. He wasn't moving. He had his ear pressed against the cold steel, his hand gripping the grip of his oversized kinetic pistol. "What is it?" Sylvia whispered, throwing her legs over the side of the cot. "Heavy boots," Donovan murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. 4 of them. Moving in sync. Not station security. "The Syndicate," Sylvia breathed, panic rising in her chest like cold water. "How did they find us?" "Thermal bleed." "Or they traced the credit transfer to Finn," Donovan replied, stepping back from the door. "Doesn't matter now." He looked around the small clinic. There was only one way in and one way out. It was a choke point. Tactically, it was a death trap against superior firepower. Donovan didn't look afraid. He looked annoyed. "Get behind the surgical autoclave," Donovan ordered, pointing to a massive, reinforced steel cylinder in the back corner. "Keep your head down. Cover your ears." Sylvia scrambled across the floor, sliding behind the cold metal cylinder. She curled her knees to her chest. A high-pitched whine pierced the air. It was a thermal-cutting torch. The heavy lock on the blast door began to glow a violent, angry orange. Molten slag dripped onto the floor, grating, hissing as it ate through the metal. Donovan didn't aim at the door. He aimed at the environmental control panel on the wall next to it. The heavy blast door gave way with a deafening screech of tearing metal. It was kicked inward by a massive figure, clad in thick, ablative assault armor. A syndicate breacher. The alien stood 7 feet tall, holding a rotary plasma cannon that spun up with a terrifying hum. Before the breacher could acquire a target, Donovan pulled the trigger. He didn't shoot the breacher. He shot the control panel. The heavy lead slug shattered the electronics. Sparks showered the room, and the clinic's emergency fire suppression system triggered instantly. Thick, blinding, cryogenic foam sprayed from the ceiling vents, dropping the ambient temperature in the room by 40 degrees in a matter of seconds. The thermal optics on the breacher's helmet instantly white out, blinded by the sudden, massive thermal shift. The giant alien roared in confusion, firing its plasma cannon blindly into the room. Searing bolts of blue energy tore through the clinic, melting surgical tables and shattering glass. But they were firing wild. Donovan moved. He didn't retreat. He charged directly into the blinding white foam. Sylvia covered her ears, screaming as the deafening roar of the plasma cannon shook the very foundation of the room. Through the thick haze of the cryofoam, she saw a shadow leap onto the massive armored breacher. Donovan slammed his heavy shoulder, the injured one, directly into the breacher's chest plate. The sheer kinetic force of a high-density human moving at a dead sprint staggered the massive alien. The breacher swung its heavy weapon like a club, catching Donovan in the ribs. The sickening crack of human bone echoed through the foam. Donovan fell to one knee, gasping for air. The second syndicate enforcer stepped through the ruined doorway, raising a precision laser rifle. Donovan didn't have time to aim. From his kneeling position, he pointed his hand cannon and fired. The recoil snapped his wrist back, but the heavy slug tore through the unarmored joint of the second enforcer's knee. The alien shrieked, collapsing into the molten slag at the doorway. The breacher recovered, stepping forward to execute the kneeling human. Sylvia couldn't just watch. She couldn't be the helpless payload anymore. She looked frantically around her hiding spot. Above the autoclave was a heavy, pressurized tank of synthesized medical oxygen. "Donovan!" Sylvia screamed, her voice cracking over the noise. She grabbed a discarded surgical scalpel from the floor and hurled it at the breacher. It bounced harmlessly off the heavy armor, but the alien's head snapped toward the noise. It was a fraction of a second of distraction. Donovan didn't waste it. He lunged upward, ignoring his broken ribs. He grabbed the barrel of the plasma cannon and wrenched it upward with terrifying raw strength. The muscles in his arms bulged, veins standing out against his pale skin. The breacher fought back, trying to force the weapon down, but the human's mechanical leverage and sheer density were overwhelming. With a roar of exertion, Donovan twisted the weapon violently to the right, snapping the alien's armored wrist. The breacher howled, dropping the cannon. Donovan stepped in, drawing a heavy, serrated combat knife from his boot in one fluid motion. He drove it upward, bypassing the thick chest armor and burying the blade deep into the soft, unarmored gap under the alien's chin. The massive breacher shuddered, black blood spraying across Donovan's face and white shirt. The alien collapsed backward, hitting the floor with a concussive thud. Silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the hiss of the cryofoam and the groans of the enforcer with the shattered knee at the door. Donovan stood over the dead breacher, his chest heaving. Blood ran down his chin. He reached up, wiping it away with the back of a shaking hand. He looked down at his torso, probing his ribs with thick fingers. He winced, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. Sylvia slowly stood up from behind the autoclave. Her legs were trembling so violently she had to hold on to the metal cylinder to stay upright. The clinic was completely destroyed. Donovan walked over to the surviving enforcer at the door. The alien was clutching its ruined leg, staring up at the human with absolute terror. "Who sent the location?" Donovan asked. His voice was calm. It was the calmness of a man asking for the time. "Go to hell, Deathworlder!" The alien spat, its translation collar clicking. Donovan raised his heavy boot and brought it down on the alien's shattered knee. The crunch of bone was audible over the screaming. "Who sent the location?" Donovan repeated. "Vincent!" The alien sobbed, thrashing in agony. "Vincent has the station's grid. He's tracking the diplomatic biometric chips. You can't hide her." Donovan stared down at the alien for a long moment. Then he brought the heavy grip of his pistol down on the alien's helmet, knocking it unconscious. He turned back to Sylvia. The white foam was clinging to her hair, her imported dress ruined beyond repair. "Biometrics," Donovan said softly. He looked at her left wrist, where her diplomatic identification chip was subdermally implanted. "They aren't tracking me. They're tracking you." Sylvia looked at her wrist. A small, faint blue light pulsed under her skin. It was her identity, her access to the highest echelons of galactic power. Now, it was a homing beacon for a slaughter. "Take it out," Sylvia said, her voice shaking but resolute. She held her arm out toward him. Donovan looked at her hand, then up to her eyes. He drew his serrated knife, the blade still slick with black alien blood. "It's going to hurt," he warned. "Do it," she ordered. She was done being the prey. Cold steel pressed against her pale wrist. Sylvia didn't pull away, though every instinct in her refined, civilized brain screamed at her to run. She watched Donovan's hands. For a man who had just snapped an armored alien's neck with brute force, his fingers were remarkably steady. He didn't hesitate. He pressed the serrated edge of his combat knife into her flesh and pulled. Pain flared, sharp and blinding. Sylvia bit down on her bottom lip, hard enough to draw blood, refusing to scream. She felt the blade scrape against the underlying muscle, a sickening sensation that made her vision swim. Donovan grunted, digging the tip of the blade under a small, hard node beneath her skin. With a quick, brutal flick, he popped the biometric chip out. It clattered onto the metal grating, covered in a slick layer of red. "Hold this," Donovan instructed, pressing a wad of sterile gauze from Finn's ruined supplies against her bleeding wrist. "Hard." Sylvia pressed down, her entire body shaking, gasping for air. Donovan picked up the bloody chip. The faint blue light was still pulsing, dutifully broadcasting her exact location to Vincent's executioners. "We need a distraction," Donovan muttered. He looked around the destroyed clinic. His eyes landed on the ventilation grate above the autoclave. He grabbed a heavy metal stool, dragged it over, and climbed up, favoring his shattered ribs with a sharp hiss of breath. Ripping the grate off with one hand, he tossed the chip deep into the vertical exhaust shaft. The powerful updraft immediately caught the tiny piece of hardware, carrying it away into the station's upper atmosphere scrubbers. "They will track that to the ventilation hub," Sylvia said, her voice tight with pain. "That buys us maybe 20 minutes. 10, Donovan corrected, stepping down heavily. Syndicate hunters aren't stupid. Once they realize the chip is moving at 80 miles an hour through an air duct, they'll know it's a decoy. But 10 minutes is all I need to get us out of the scan grid." He walked over to a heavy storage locker in the corner of the room, one that had miraculously survived the plasma crossfire. He kicked the latch until it broke, pulling out a thick, insulated maintenance coat and tossing it to her. "Put that on," he said. "Your dress is a beacon. We need you looking like a pipe rat." Sylvia didn't argue. She slipped the heavy, foul-smelling canvas coat over her ruined silk dress. It swamped her small frame, smelling of grease and old sweat, but it covered the blood. She looked at Donovan. He was wrapping a long strip of rigid medical tape tightly around his chest, binding his broken ribs. His white shirt was practically painted crimson and black. He looked like a corpse that had simply refused the grave. "How are you still standing?" she asked, genuine awe cutting through her fear. "Your ribs are broken. You have a massive burn on your shoulder. You should be in a coma." Donovan finished tying off the tape and pulled his canvas jacket back on, wincing as the fabric rubbed against his stapled flesh. Human skeletal structure is dense. We evolved to take a beating from predators much larger than us. Our brains flood our system with endorphins to mask the pain so we can run or fight. He picked up his heavy kinetic pistol, slamming a fresh magazine of thick lead slugs into the grip. "Right now, my brain is telling me I'm perfectly fine. Tomorrow, I probably won't be able to walk, but we only have to survive until tomorrow." He didn't offer any false hope. He didn't promise her everything would be fine. He just stated the biological facts of his violent existence. Sylvia found it strangely comforting. "Where are we going?" she asked, clutching the gauze to her wrist. "Down," Donovan replied, pointing to a heavy floor hatch at the back of the clinic. "Into the station's geothermal core. The ambient radiation and heat down there will scramble any thermal optics they have. They won't be able to see us from a distance. They'll have to get close." "The core?" Sylvia's eyes widened. "The ambient temperature there is lethal for my species. It's over 45 degrees Celsius. I will hyperventilate." "You'll sweat," Donovan said bluntly, hauling the heavy metal hatch open. A wave of oppressive metallic heat instantly rolled up into the room. "And you'll drink water. I'll carry you if I have to, but if we stay up here, they will pin us down and burn us out. Down there, we make them fight on our terms." He climbed down the ladder first, his massive frame disappearing into the red-lit gloom of the descent shaft. Sylvia hesitated for only a second. She looked at the dead, armored breacher on the floor, a brutal reminder of the reality she now inhabited. She grabbed the rusted rungs of the ladder and followed the Deathworlder into the dark. The descent was agonizing. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became. It tasted of sulfur and burning oil. The metal rungs were hot to the touch. By the time they reached the bottom of the shaft, Sylvia's breathing was shallow and frantic. Her heart raced, her alien physiology struggling to process the extreme heat. They emerged onto a narrow steel catwalk suspended over a massive churning turbine. The roar of the machinery was deafening, a constant physical pressure against the eardrums. Below them, massive coolant pipes glowed a dull cherry red. Donovan walked with a slow, deliberate pace, his head swiveling. He was sweating profusely, his skin slick and shining in the dim light. To Sylvia's astonishment, he didn't seem distressed by the heat. He seemed entirely acclimated to it. "Earth is hotter than this in the summer," Donovan yelled over the roar of the turbines, noticing her stare. "We actually pay money to sit in heated wooden boxes just to sweat. Keeps the pores clean." Sylvia couldn't tell if he was joking or if humanity was truly that fundamentally insane. She leaned against the railing, coughing violently as the sulphurous air burned her lungs. Donovan stopped, his hand suddenly shooting out to grab her shoulder, pulling her flat against the metal grating. "Movement," he mouthed, his eyes locked on a series of catwalks 3 levels above them. Sylvia squinted through the haze of steam. Shadows were shifting against the red emergency lights. The syndicate hadn't fallen for the decoy for long. They had anticipated the core route. They were being hunted. Steam hissed from a ruptured exhaust valve, creating a thick, blinding fog across the industrial chasm. Sylvia lay completely still against the hot metal grating, her pulse pounding in her ears. Above them, the unmistakable click of magnetic boots echoed off the cavernous walls. The syndicate hunters were descending. Donovan didn't look up. He closed his eyes, tilting his head slightly, listening not to the boots, but to the rhythm of the machinery. He was calculating the intervals of the steam vents, timing the deafening roar of the massive turbines below them. He tapped Sylvia's arm, pointing a scarred finger toward a thick cluster of insulated coolant pipes 20 yards down their catwalk. He held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1, as the massive turbine below them roared to life, drowning out all other noise in a wall of industrial sound. Donovan hauled Sylvia to her feet. They sprinted, or rather, Sylvia sprinted, while Donovan moved with a terrifying, silent speed that defied his bulk and his injuries. They slid behind the heavy pipes just as a searing beam of blue energy melted the grating exactly where they had been lying seconds before. 3 of them, Donovan rasped, pressing his back against the vibrating metal pipe. He ejected the magazine of his pistol, checked the brass casings in the dim light, and slammed it back into place. Light armor. Optic visors. They're using suppression tactics to pin us down. We are trapped, Sylvia panicked, her chest heaving as she struggled for oxygen in the sweltering heat. The catwalk ends in 50 yards. There's nowhere to run. Good, Donovan said. The corner of his mouth twitched upward in a grim, ugly smirk. I was getting tired of running. He didn't wait for them to close the distance. Humans, Sylvia was quickly learning, did not possess a normal prey drive. When cornered, they didn't cower. They became the apex predator their planet had forged them to be. Donovan stepped out from behind the pipes. He didn't aim down the sights. He simply pointed his heavy hand cannon up toward the gantry above and fired twice in rapid succession. The booming concussions echoed like artillery fire in the enclosed space. He wasn't aiming at the hunters. He aimed at the heavy retaining brackets, holding a massive, suspended ventilation duct directly above their position. The heavy lead slugs shattered the corroded brackets. With a screech of tearing metal, tons of steel ductwork detached from the ceiling and plummeted downward. It crashed through the hunter's catwalk, entirely collapsing the structure. 2 of the alien assassins fell screaming into the darkness, swallowed by the churning machinery below. The 3rd managed to leap clear, landing heavily on Donovan and Sylvia's level, rolling to absorb the impact. The assassin came up fast, raising a sleek, high-end plasma carbine. Donovan was already moving. He didn't bother shooting. He knew at this range, an energy shield might deflect a glancing kinetic blow just long enough for the alien to pull the trigger. He closed the gap with a terrifying primal roar, launching his massive frame forward like a battering ram. He slammed into the alien before the carbine could fully charge. The impact sent both of them crashing into the railing. The metal groaned in protest. The assassin, highly trained and agile, tried to bring the carbine up into Donovan's gut. Donovan caught the barrel with his bare left hand. The heated metal instantly began searing his palm, the smell of burning human flesh mingling with the sulfur. But he didn't let go. He simply ignored the pain, his jaw locking in sheer, unadulterated rage. With his right hand, he drove his heavy fist into the alien's helmet. The reinforced visor cracked. Donovan hit it again, and again. The sheer kinetic output of a human throwing a punch was devastating. Bone, muscle, and gravity worked in perfect, violent harmony. On the 4th strike, the helmet shattered completely. The alien went limp, slipping over the broken railing and vanishing into the abyss below. Donovan leaned over the bent railing, gasping for breath. His left hand was badly burned, angry blisters already forming across the palm. He looked at it, flexed his fingers with a grimace, and wiped the blood from his knuckles onto his trousers. "Are there more?" Sylvia asked, stepping out from behind the pipes. She was trembling so hard she could barely walk. Always. Donovan breathed heavily. He turned to face her, his chest heaving against the tight medical tape. Vincent isn't going to stop sending them until his credit accounts run dry. A loud, metallic clack echoed from the far end of the catwalk. Sylvia spun around. A fourth hunter had silently dropped from a service hatch behind them. This one was different. He wore no heavy armor, just a sleek, matte black bodysuit. He held a long, thin vibro blade that hummed with lethal frequency. An elite executioner. The assassin didn't posture. He didn't speak. He simply lunged toward Sylvia, recognizing her as the soft target. He crossed the distance with terrifying, unnatural speed, the blade arcing toward her throat. Donovan was too far away. He shoved himself off the railing, but his broken ribs finally betrayed him. His leg buckled, sending him crashing to one knee on the metal grating. He raised his gun, but the executioner was already inside his line of fire, using Sylvia as a human shield. Time seemed to slow down. Sylvia saw the vibrating edge of the blade approaching. She remembered the dead breacher. She remembered Donovan's steady hands, cutting into her flesh. She realized that relying on someone else to bleed for her was no longer an option. She didn't freeze. She dropped to the floor. The vibro blade sliced cleanly through the empty air where her neck had been a fraction of a second earlier, shearing a lock of her hair. The executioner stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him past her, over the floor grating. That stumble was all Donovan needed. The assassin's head cleared Sylvia's silhouette. The heavy kinetic pistol roared. The executioner's body jerked violently sideways as the slug took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Before he could recover, Donovan was back on his feet. He crossed the remaining distance in 2 heavy strides, kicking the vibro blade out of the alien's hand. Donovan grabbed the executioner by the throat and slammed him against the hot coolant pipes. The alien shrieked as the metal seared through his thin bodysuit. "Tell Vincent," Donovan growled, leaning in close so the alien could smell the blood and copper on his breath, "that I'm tired of playing defense." With a brutal shove, Donovan tossed the assassin over the railing. Silence descended on the catwalk, save for the mechanical heartbeat of the station. Donovan stood panting, staring down into the darkness. He slowly turned to look at Sylvia, who was still kneeling on the grating, clutching her ruined coat. "You ducked," Donovan said, a faint trace of actual respect coloring his gravelly voice. "I am adapting," Sylvia replied, pulling herself up using the railing. She looked at his burned hand, his ruined shoulder, and the sheer exhaustion etched into his features. "But you are dying, Donovan. You cannot keep fighting like this." "I don't plan to," he said, picking up the discarded vibro blade and sliding it into his belt. He looked up toward the ceiling, tracing the massive power conduits leading out of the core. "The defensive contract is over. We're going on the offensive." "What does that mean?" Sylvia asked, dread pooling in her stomach. Donovan checked his gun one last time. "It means we stop hiding. We go to the upper levels. We go to Vincent. Elevators in the Traverse station were built for unparalleled luxury. Soft velvet walls, ambient harp music, and zero-gravity acceleration designed to prevent even the slightest discomfort. Donovan bled on the imported velvet. He didn't care. Sylvia stood next to him, her ruined canvas coat contrasting sharply with the gold leaf trim of the doors. They were heading to the spire, Vincent's domain. "He will have the Praetorian Guard waiting," Sylvia warned, staring at the floor indicator, ticking relentlessly upward. "They don't use plasma. They use localized sonic disruptors. It liquefies internal organs without breaking the skin. Your bone density won't matter." "Sound requires a medium to travel," Donovan replied. His breath was shallow, his broken ribs protesting every word. He reached into his satchel and pulled out 2 heavy, cylindrical metal canisters. We changed the medium. Ding. The elevator chimed a polite, melodic note. The brass doors slid open. The penthouse lobby was a sprawling expanse of white marble and imported synth glass overlooking the artificial stars of the station. 4 Praetorian guards stood in perfect formation, clad in pristine silver armor. They raised their sonic rifles, the air already vibrating with a lethal, low-frequency hum. Donovan didn't step out. He pulled the pins on the metal canisters and kicked them across the polished marble floor. White phosphorus. The canisters detonated, instantly sucking the oxygen from the air and replacing it with a thick, blinding, hyper-dense smoke that burned at over 2,000 degrees. The sonic disruptors fired, but the sound waves hit the superheated, dense particulate cloud and scattered, warping into a harmless, clicking static. Donovan walked into the smoke. He didn't run. He stalked. Sylvia stayed in the elevator, pressing a damp cloth over her nose and mouth, exactly as Donovan had instructed. She listened. There were no energy blasts. There was no heroic banter. There was only the brutal, rhythmic sound of heavy kinetic impacts, the sickening crunch of silver armor caving in under sheer physical force. A wet thud. A gasp cut brutally short. It lasted exactly 30 seconds. The smoke began to clear, aggressively sucked away by the penthouse's emergency ventilation systems. Donovan stood in the center of the lobby. All 4 Praetorian guards were on the ground. None of them were moving. Donovan was completely out of ammunition for his kinetic pistol. He held one of their pristine silver helmets in his massive, burned hand. He tossed it aside. It clattered loudly against the marble. "Clear," he coughed, his voice ragged, spitting a glob of blood onto the pristine floor. Sylvia stepped out of the elevator. She didn't look at the bodies. She looked at the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall. Vincent's office. Donovan walked up to the doors. He didn't bother checking for an electronic lock. He raised his heavy boot and kicked the wood perfectly adjacent to the hinges. The oak splintered inward with a deafening crack, tearing the frame out of the wall entirely. Vincent sat behind a massive desk of imported mahogany. He was a wealthy aristocrat, dressed in immaculate tailored silks, but his face was chalk white. A translucent blue energy shield hummed across the front of his desk, a localized military-grade defense grid. 2 more elite guards stood flanking him, their weapons drawn and charging. "Shoot him!" Vincent shrieked, his political composure entirely shattered by the sight of the bloody human stepping over his ruined door. The guards fired. Donovan didn't even attempt to dodge. He simply lowered his head and charged. Plasma burned across his ribs, blackening the canvas jacket and searing his flesh. But his momentum was absolute. He hit the first guard like a freight train, driving the alien backward with such force that they crashed through the floor-to-ceiling glass window behind the desk. The synth glass shattered, pulling the guard out into the freezing void of the station's artificial atmosphere. The second guard hesitated, entirely unprepared for an enemy that simply ignored lethal trauma. That hesitation was his last mistake. Donovan grabbed the guard's rifle by the barrel, yanked the alien forward, and head-butted him. The human skull, remarkably thick and dense by galactic standards, cracked the alien's faceplate wide open. The guard crumpled instantly. Donovan turned to Vincent. The human was bleeding from a dozen wounds. His breath rattled wetly in his chest. He looked less like a bodyguard and more like a localized natural disaster. "Your shield," Vincent stammered, pushing his heavy leather chair frantically against the back wall. "It will stop any projectile. It will vaporize any blade you throw. You can't touch me." Donovan walked up to the glowing blue barrier. He looked at it. He looked at Vincent, cowering behind it. "Energy shields," Donovan rasped, wiping blood from his eye with a charred sleeve. are designed to stop high-velocity impacts, plasma, lasers, bullets. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't wind up for a devastating punch. He simply placed his heavy, calloused hands flat against the shimmering blue energy field. "They aren't calibrated," Donovan continued, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm baseline, "for low velocity, sustained kinetic pressure." He pushed. The shield hummed, flaring blindingly bright blue as it attempted to repel the foreign object. But Donovan wasn't striking it. He was simply leaning his entire body weight into it. 220 pounds of dense, earth-grown muscle, fueled by adrenaline and absolute spite. The generator under Vincent's desk whined in violent protest. Sparks began to shower from the localized emitters. "Stop," Vincent whispered, his eyes widening in pure, unfiltered horror. Donovan pushed harder. The thick tendons in his neck strained. His heavy boots gripped the marble floor, grinding deep scratches into the stone as he forced himself forward. The blue light flickered erratically. The generator let out a high-pitched, failing scream. With a sharp pop, the emitters overloaded. The shield collapsed. Donovan reached across the desk, grabbed Vincent by the front of his expensive silk shirt, and hauled him entirely over the mahogany surface. With a dismissive shove, he threw the aristocrat onto the floor at Sylvia's feet. Vincent scrambled backward, staring up at the diplomat he had tried to systematically assassinate. Sylvia looked down at him. Her pristine dress was gone, replaced by a filthy, foul-smelling maintenance coat. Her hands were stained with her own blood. She had never looked more dangerous. "The summit is tomorrow, Vincent," Sylvia said. Her voice was cold, perfectly steady. "I will testify. You will go to an orbital penal colony. If you ever send another assassin after me, I won't hire Donovan to protect me." She leaned down slightly, meeting Vincent's terrified, wide eyes. "I will hire him to find you." Vincent scrambled away on his hands and knees, sobbing, entirely broken by the sheer psychological weight of his failure. Donovan watched the aristocrat crawl out of the ruined office. He didn't smile. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out his dented metal flask, and took a long, steady drink. "Contract fulfilled," he grunted, wincing as he leaned heavily against the mahogany desk. "I need a doctor." Sylvia looked at the human. He was battered, burned, and bleeding onto the expensive rug. But he was standing. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy, physical credit chip. 4 million credits, Sylvia said softly, pressing the chip into his good hand. Plus a bonus for the penthouse. Donovan pocketed the chip. "Pleasure doing business." Wow, what an explosive ending. If you loved this deep dive into raw human resilience and absolute defiance, hit that like button right now. Sylvia evolved from a helpless diplomat to a true survivor, and Donovan proved exactly why Deathworlders are the most terrifying force in the galaxy. Share this video with your sci-fi loving friends and subscribe for more epic HFY stories that showcase the undeniable grit of humanity. What did you think of Donovan's brutal, low-velocity shield takedown? Drop a comment below and let us know. See you in the next adventure.